Hey everybody, if you're just getting started working with Microsoft Azure and you're wondering about the certification, exams, and roles and not quite sure where to start, well, in this lesson, I'll help you to understand how this works from Microsoft because it is a little bit different to some of the other cloud providers. So, when we think about going off and getting certified, we're typically looking at something like basic fundamentals, maybe just getting started working with Azure, or some other sort of discipline that might be security, perhaps administration, or maybe you are working as a developer. Now, these are just a couple of the different levels that you might be working toward, but there is actually one more. So perhaps you want to work toward being a solution architect. So you can see that when we talk about different certifications, we're talking about different pathways and different levels. At the base level, we have the foundational knowledge, which is going to cover off a range of different topics, but just at a really basic level. You'll only need to know how to describe them and what they are. You won't really be expected to work with them, configure them, deploy them, or anything like that. When we talk about the associate level, we are now talking about a little bit deeper in terms of knowledge, actually performing some tasks, securing some products, administering, deploying, developing, building, and working with in general. Now, if you want to have a longer term vision, you might be working towards something like the expert level certification, such as the solution architect. This is where you're going to take a deeper level of knowledge, and it's also actually going to be quite broad as well. Typically, we are building on all of the different knowledge that you've learned through the foundation and associate levels. Now, all of this so far is pretty common to most of the cloud providers. And in fact, you can see several of the other cloud providers even include specialities as well. So what we're talking about here isn't really anything new. But with that being said, when you work with Microsoft and Azure certifications and exams, you'll actually come to learn that things are done a little bit differently. And sometimes that can be confusing if you've worked with the other cloud providers first. So to help understand that, let's actually talk now about exams and certification. Let's say you're just getting started and you're working toward your Azure Administrator certification. Now you might look at this and think, okay, I'm going to go off, I'm going to do some study, and I'm going to sit that Azure Administrator exam. And if I pass that, I will achieve my Azure Administrator certification. Now, a really key point that I'm trying to make here is that Microsoft does actually look at exams and certifications as being two separate and distinct entities. And at a really high level, why is that? Well, to put it simply, you might have to do more than one exam to achieve a certification. For many of the other cloud providers, it's typically a one-for-one mapping from the exam to the certification, and so you don't even really hear these terms used to describe two different things. But that is not the case with Microsoft. With Microsoft, these are in fact two distinct entities. Now, the other thing to understand about this is that there are different pathways to achieve your certification. So for example, if you were working toward that Azure Administrator certification, what you might actually choose to do instead is go off, get started, work with the Azure Foundations, sit that examination, get that certification first, and then move on to the Azure Administrator next. Now, I do definitely think that foundations are very, very important, and they are things that you should not neglect to learn, just like all of the other knowledge and hands-on skills that I definitely encourage as you work through my content. But what's important to understand right now is that when you work with Microsoft certifications, some of these pathways are optional and some of them are actually mandatory. So for the Azure Administrator, for example, if you like, you could just go ahead and jump straight into your study for the Azure Administrator exam and go off and achieve your certification. In fact, if you join me in my Azure Administrator course at Cloudly, you'll find that I actually build that course in a way that does support that. It supports people from various different backgrounds being able to just jump straight in. And if you don't have any of that foundational knowledge, well, that's why I have the free Getting Started course to speed you on your journey to getting certified. So those are just a couple of things to bear in mind. One, exams and certifications are different. And two, depending on the certification you are targeting, you might have a mandatory path that you have to take. So let's have a chat about mandatory pathways now. Let's say that you actually want to go ahead and work toward your Azure Architect certification. If you've just gotten started working with Azure and you have achieved no other certifications, you might do a whole heap of study and work toward your Azure Administrator exam. And if you pass that, you're probably hoping that now you're going to achieve your certification. Well, that is not the case. The Azure Architect Expert certification is one of the certifications that does have mandatory requirements. For the Azure Architect certification, you can sit your Azure Administrator exam whenever you like. But if you don't have that Azure Administrator certification, you're not going to achieve the Azure Architect certification, even if you pass the Azure Administrator exam. So this is just one example of a certification that requires a mandatory prerequisite certification for you to achieve it. So typically you're going to find this for the expert level certifications. Azure Architect Expert certification relies on the Azure Administration certification. Also, the DevOps Engineer Expert certification relies on either a administrator certification or a developer certification, just one of the two. Now, in these scenarios, you can in fact sit the exams in whatever order you like. You could go ahead and pass your Azure Architect examination before you pass your Azure Administrator examination, but that just means that you'll need to wait until you pass both before you have both certifications. Okay, so that's the difference between exams and certifications. The last thing I wanted to cover off is roles. When you're working with Microsoft and Azure certification, you'll find that there's lots of different certs that you can go and achieve. If you're looking at apps and architecture, you might be covering off the fundamentals, administration, development, architecture, DevOps, and much more that I haven't listed here. If instead of that you're actually interested in data and AI, well, you can find other fundamentals exams there as well, such as the AI fundamentals or the data fundamentals, and various other certifications like the Data Engineer, Power Platform App Maker, and Cosmos DB Developer Speciality. Now, what you might be starting to notice here is that you've got both Azure and Microsoft certifications that are available. So for example, when you look at the different security certificates that are available, okay, you're going to see that there's not just Azure security related certs, but there's a lot of different certs for the other Microsoft products as well. But everything that we've spoken about within this lesson does apply to the various Microsoft or Azure certifications. Now you might be looking at this screen and thinking, is that it? Is it just these three categories, just these groups of certifications that I can work toward? And no, that's certainly not the case. It used to be in the past that Microsoft didn't have as many certifications as they do now. And Microsoft had a nice one-page diagram that was all pretty and color-coded and helped you to plan what comes next in your certification journey. However, that's no longer the case. So I definitely would encourage you to check out the following website, learn.microsoft.com/certifications. If you scroll down, you'll see Microsoft's approach to certification is driven by role and skills. So you can take a look at the different roles, get an understanding of what they are, and take a look at possible exams and certifications you might want to work toward. Now, another view that you might find helpful is the Browse view, where you can go off and you can type in whatever sort of filters you want to find the certification that's right for you. Just bear in mind, like we've spoke of within this lesson, that on the left-hand side, we have the difference here between certifications and examination. So if you are working toward a certification, I would encourage you to tick the certification option first. And then, for example, we might scroll up and we might look at Architect. Now I can go ahead and click on Search. And you'll see, for example, we've got the Certified Azure Solutions Architect Expert certification. Now, since I've searched for certifications, that means I can scroll down and I can get an overview here of what examination I need to complete and pass to achieve the certification. So do just bear in mind that certification and examination are two separate things. If we were taking a look at the DevOps Engineer, for example, you would actually see two options here, either the Azure Administrator Associate or the Azure Developer Associate, and then the examination to achieve your Expert DevOps Engineer certification. So folks, that's just been a quick walkthrough of how certification works for Microsoft and this handy tool that you can use to go off and find a role or certification that you want to work toward. If you've got any questions at all, please do feel welcome to reach out, and best of luck on your learning journey.